Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Avi, and I help run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Julian Sancton's new book, Madhouse at the End of the Earth, the Belgica's Journey into the Dark Antarctic Night, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors such as Julian, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we're thrilled to have with us Julian Sancton for the launch of his debut book, Madhouse at the End of the Earth. Julian Sancton has been an editor at Vanity Fair, Esquire, and Departures. He has written for such publications as The New Yorker, Wired, and Playboy. He has reported from every continent, including Antarctica, which he first visited while researching this book. Joining Julian in conversation is Sam Anderson. Sam is currently a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, formerly a book critic for New York Magazine, and regular contributor to Slate. Anderson's journalism and essays have won numerous awards, including the National Magazine Award for Essays and Criticism. He currently lives in New York with his family. So without further ado, please welcome Julian Sancton and Sam Anderson to the stage.
Well, hey, thanks everyone for coming, and congratulations, Julian, on the book.
Thank you, Sam.
Which is incredible. Here it is. I think there's a link on your screen where you can click and buy the book. I blew through this thing in a couple of days. And I guess that brings me to my first question. There's so much I want to talk about. I want to talk about ice. I want to talk so much about penguins. But are you okay after writing this book, after immersing yourself in this material? Are you holding up all right? Because this is one of the most stressful, thrilling and stressful reads I have ever encountered. And I cannot imagine what it must have been like to live this for 5 years or whatever it took you to write the book.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you should ask. Another person who had read the book asked me the same question, and had pointed out there's one of the main characters after a traumatic event grows a beard, and I up until recently had a beard closer to yours than to mine. And he said, and I wrote that he grew a beard during a dark night of the soul, as some men do. And so he asked me, is there something you want to tell me? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it was living through this vicariously is probably a lot easier than living through it normally. So it was, I think at the end of the process, I was starting to get some idea of the stress that these men were feeling when they were stuck in the ice for a year through the Antarctic winter, and I think all of us did during the confinement,
sure.
And the forced isolation and the period of despair and uncertainty. I mean, I can't compare myself to them, nor to people who really suffer during this time. But I think it was trying to get into their heads was not a great place to be, and it was filled with rats and scurvy and madness and yeah.
There's so many jump scares in it. There's so many people falling down an ice crevice that just opened, or falling into the Antarctic Sea.
That's how it was.
Yeah.
They couldn't trust where they were putting their foot. It's something they could look. I mean, they were surrounded by ice that looked to them for all the world like just a white desert. One of the characters called it a parody of terra firma. It looks like it's a landscape, but it's all illusory. Right. Every step can just be maybe slush covered with snow and looking as solid as everything around it. And if you can't trust your step, you start losing your mind. You can't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't trust anything in this book, basically. So let's give people maybe a little bit of an overview.
Sure. Yeah.
This really, I mean, have you sold the movie rights yet? Because this feels like about 15 different kinds of movie all wrapped up together. It's like a horror movie and an adventure movie. There's so many action scenes that are just dying to be filmed, right?
Cross your fingers. It's in the works, but it's definitely, I definitely was going. It struck me just from the first time I heard this story as almost a genre story, even though it really happened. It even followed a natural 3-act structure. I'll give it a little background. It's the story of a Belgian expedition to the Antarctic, the first scientific expedition to the Antarctic, at the very tail end of the 19th century. It was led by a untested young Belgian commander named Adrien de Gerlache, who decided that it had been 50 years since the last serious expedition to the Antarctic, and there were still so many prizes to be claimed down there. It was pretty much uncharted. It was pretty much a void at the bottom of the planet. And why wouldn't he and Belgium go and claim it?
Which was an absurd thing to think.
Absurd idea.
People might hear Belgium and think it's just kind of your standard European country, but it's not quite that, right?
It's not quite that. It was younger than any of the other countries. It was probably 60 years old at that point, and it had been left since its separation with the Netherlands with almost no maritime presence. It was an absurd idea for a young Belgian, especially a young Belgian aristocrat, to have a dream of a life on the seas. It was just not done. And any Belgian adventurer at that time would have been more likely to seek his fortune in the Congo, which was the horrendous, colonial project run by Leopold II. To have this dream of the Antarctic and of ocean-going adventure was remarkable and romantic, and in a lot of ways completely misguided, because he was not at all prepared.
Right. So we've got this. You start with this great scene in 1897 with an old whaling ship. He's kind of excruciatingly raised the money, just kind of the bare bones budget to get through this. He's got his ship. He's got cobbled together kind of a crew of men who are more or less qualified. And then immediately they hit a sandbar and the engine breaks. And I mean, it's this triumphant scene, this triumphant exit where there's 20,000 people and there's cannons being fired off. And
right. And then the engine conks out. It was a comedy of errors the whole way. And what were errors at the beginning and indeed comedic turned out to be just catastrophic by the time these errors piled up one after the next. And it became a series of system failures. By the time they got to the Antarctic, they had lost so much time. They had lost so much of their crew along the way to dismissals and firings and near mutinies, that they were unprepared for wintering in the ice, which didn't have to happen. It happened because the commander was so far behind, and he feared that he wouldn't have anything to crow about. He wasn't even close to getting to a southern record by the time the winter started closing in, and the winter ice started, making the southern latitudes inaccessible. He figured that he would have a better story to tell if he locked himself in the ice, if he pursued a hopeless southern route deep into the Antarctic pack ice. He would be among the first men, or his men would be the first to endure an Antarctic winter, and that in itself was probably even more electrifying, he figured, to the public than being able to say that they'd undertaken a year's worth of scientific observation in the Antarctic. I mean, one of the amazing psychological undercurrents that's running through this whole thing, and I want to talk about the characters specifically, but it's just the captain himself and this incredible sensitivity he has about the Belgian press and what the Belgian press is going to think about his expedition. And he lets that, I mean, he's 10,000 miles away from home. Yeah. He's, as you said, he's made this calamitous trip and finally gotten down there, and icebergs are passing and they're seeing penguins and all these things, and he's made it. And there comes that moment, that incredible moment where he has to make a decision, because as you said, they're much later than they thought they'd be. The ice is closing in, and something I'd never really thought about was, right, if you stay down there for the winter, your ship gets locked in the ice. You're going to be spending many months minimum. Exactly. They were the most isolated humans on Earth at that point. They were probably, hundreds of miles from the nearest person, and that nearest person didn't know where they were. They were probably the only people on the continent, or, on the sea ice around the continent. Right. And the ice locks them in. And how long are they locked in this ice? More than a year. Yeah, it was a baffling decision, especially because he knew what the fate that could befall a ship that was stuck in the ice. He knew about John Franklin in the Arctic, and the way the ice crushed his two ships and committed them to the deep. And he knew what happened to the Jeannette in the Bering Strait. He knew that this was a fate that most explorers try their damnedest to avoid.
Right.
And yet he pursued it.
Right. It's almost like, I'm trying to think of a modern analogy. It's like being in a space shuttle and you're kind of on a mission to the moon, and you got delayed and everything went wrong, and the pets on board died, and at a certain point you have to decide, like, well, am I going to go left? Am I going to head back to Earth, or will I take a left and go check out that asteroid field and try to do something really impressive and shock everyone with my boldness? And he went left, and he got locked in the ice.
And for some reason, his paramount concern for a lot of that time, indeed, was the Belgian press. He was worried about, when it turned out that the men were really dissatisfied with their rations and with the quality of the food. It sounds like a Woody Allen joke, but that there's the food is terrible in such small portions. But the men were complaining of this, and he did not want to. He was afraid that the press would accuse him of eating too well, and of using the money that he had raised in Belgium and abusing of it and eating too well. He was already sensitive that people had already pointed out the fact that they ate foie gras, that they brought foie gras on board, even though it was pork foie gras, which is not quite as appetizing as goose liver. And so anyway, he when he mentioned to his captain that this was his concern, the captain said, it was one of the few times he lost his cool. He said, I can't believe you care about this. I don't care about the press at all, especially not the Antarctic press.
Right. Right.
So
yeah, your descriptions of the food are, which are based on the men's descriptions of the food, are just horrifying. I mean, that was one of the key mistakes. It turned out, all these little choices in the beginning that ended up killing some men, and one of them was they didn't have a real cook, and they had this hold full of canned food, and it was just the most awful slop you can imagine, just like colorless, tasteless.
Yeah, they had a real cook, and he was it was an international expedition. They couldn't get enough qualified Belgians because, as I said, the Belgians didn't produce many good sailors. So they filled in the ranks with Norwegian sailors, Eastern European scientists, an American doctor who I'm sure we'll talk about, and a French cook, which in theory is a good idea, but he was really unpopular, and he got the living daylights beat out of him, and then he was kicked off the ship. The man who beat him up was made the cook. Then he tried to launch a mutiny, and then he was thrown off the ship. And so the cook duties were delegated to essentially a cabin boy, the Commander de Gerlache's personal attendant, and he had no idea how to prepare this stuff. And so it's funny when you think of a lot of these survival stories, you think of them starving, or you think of them being lacking for food. They weren't lacking for food, but there is something almost as problematic is that they were unable to stomach the food that they had. And this is something that has been studied by anthropologists who are working with NASA, who were planning manned missions to Mars. The food problem, not the problem of quantity, but the problem of variety and the problem of satisfaction, is a serious one that has serious psychological consequences, as we saw in the Belgica. And so they've been looking at the Belgica is a test case for a lot of these people, is a case study. So indeed, yeah, they found no matter what was promised on the can, it's these delectable French-sounding meals like blanquette de veau and civet of rabbit. It all looked like the same colorless slop, and all was spongy and insipid, and to the point where Frederick Cook, who was the American doctor and great ideas man, said, how we long to use our teeth. We would have been satisfied if there had been pebbles for us to provide some kind of grit.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, you mentioned Cook, so let's talk about Cook, because there are a couple of characters who almost immediately kind of take over the narrative of this book, and are incredibly compelling in a way that even the commander, who is a fascinating person, is not. And one of them is this American doctor, Frederick Cook,
Yeah.
Who emerges as sort of the anti-hero, but also regular hero. He's
Exactly.
kind of a hero and a villain of this book.
That's exactly what drew me to this story. I'd read a three paragraph summary of it in an article that mentioned two facts that got me. One is it's a ship encased in ice where people go mad, and that brought to mind Edgar Allan Poe and the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, one of my favorite books. The other thing was most of the people, not all, but most of the men on the expedition were saved thanks to a man named Frederick Cook, who would go on to be one of the most maligned, one of the figures in polar exploration, one of the greatest hucksters in American history. He's remembered, if he's remembered at all today, as the man who lied about getting to the North Pole and about being the first to reach the summit of Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley, at the time that he summited, so pretended to summit it. And then he ended up as serving 7 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary for having run a Ponzi scheme involving oil shares. He was, he became a punchline, a kind of a combination of P.T. Barnum and Bernie Madoff. And so the fact that this man was also the principal reason that the men came home, the men who saved them from scurvy and depression and insanity, and led the effort to break out of the ice, to fight, to struggle in one of the great man versus nature struggles in history. Mm-hmm. The fact that those were the same man, I found irresistible.
It's amazing. I mean, he was, like you said, a total kook who, one of his ideas was to save the world essentially by harvesting penguin poop from Antarctica.
Yeah.
And he had all these wild ideas like that, but then also he was clearly a genius. I mean, as you said, he saved these men from dying of scurvy. Partly because he had been to Greenland and spent a lot of time there and respected the indigenous forms of knowledge in Greenland of the Inuit people, and decided everyone should eat raw penguin meat. Yeah. And that's what saved their lives
from scurvy,
more or less.
Scurvy and they possibly suffered from another nutritional deficiency that is recently been suggested, that a lot of what was considered scurvy down in polar missions was also something called beriberi disease, which is another deficiency of vitamin B1. But it turns out that eating penguin would have solved that too. So, but it's funny you should mention the eating the penguin harvesting idea. And a friend of mine today mentioned also that he had the idea that I mentioned in the book to create a new ark. He was so obsessed with how beneficial penguin meat was to the men, how it saved them from scurvy, and how and helped them rebuild their bodies when they'd atrophied after the long winter night. So obsessed with that he thought that the northern hemisphere should benefit from it. And he also thought that there were a lot of species in the northern hemisphere that the southern hemisphere should benefit from. So he wanted to create a new ark to basically bring all the penguins up to Greenland and all the walrus down to Antarctica. And my friend mentioned this. It sounds like a Cheech and Chong idea, just that he and Amundsen and Roald Amundsen, his best friend on this expedition, cooked up together. It was just, they weren't on anything. They were just losing their minds.
Yeah. And he was an ideas man.
Yeah.
Dr. No in James Bond, isn't he? He's got like a guano factory out on some sea rock, right?
Yeah, that was guano's a misunderstood resource. I mean, Cook tried his whole life to make this happen. He even pleading with the Danish prime minister to send penguins to Greenland. But no, he that was one of the ways in which he did save the men. He had this intuition that the Inuit, despite having a diet that consisted almost exclusively of meat and fresh game, didn't seem to suffer any kind of deficiency or from scurvy. And he assumed that even though they didn't have access to fruits or vegetables or any of the known cures for scurvy for much of the year, he reasoned that there must be something in meat that provided that kept scurvy at bay, and that intuition proved absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm. And he also he did quite a lot of other things. I mean, he seems like an incredible adventurer. He could climb an ice cliff with no trouble. He could do all kinds of heroic things, and he also intuited that what was driving the men really crazy and depressing them and chipping away at their health was a lack of light in that polar winter where you just didn't see the sun. And so he started a kind of very primitive sort of light therapy with the only tool that was available to him, which was building a fire and sort of prescribing all the men to stand in front of the fire for a couple hours at a time or something like that.
It varies. You have some a couple hours at a time, some are several hours a day, but the idea was that he, over the course of this winter in which the sun didn't rise for 70 days, and when it did, it took a while for there to be any semblance of day. He saw the way the men's bodies and minds broke down, and he associated it with a lack of light. And he had, even in his time in Greenland, in the Arctic, among the Inuit, he noticed that there were sort of physiological reactions that where people found their health was somehow suppressed and during that time. And so he associated, he came to believe that the sun was as important to human beings as it was to plants, and which is he became a sun worshiper in the way that a lot of, I guess, people who spend a lot of time in the poles can be. But he took this idea literally, that he had a conversation with he would later recall a conversation with an Inuit elder named Sipsu, who mentioned that, can't you see, they were looking up at the northern lights, and he said, can't you see the light stored in your body? And this idea stuck with him, this idea that light could be stored in the body. Now, there's nothing in Inuit metaphysics or even in folklore that says that mentions anything about the body storing light, but Cook couldn't shake this idea. He probably had misunderstood it, or Sipsu was just philosophizing and shooting the breeze. But
Cook made it up as he made up.
Or Cook made it up. There's
many things.
You can't trust anything that he writes, which was a challenge from a research perspective.
Sure.
But he came to believe that we store sunlight. And so he would have the men stand in front of a blazing fire, and which is now, light therapy is routinely used to treat seasonal affective disorder and related forms of depression. But funnily enough, I spoke during the course of my research. I spoke with a Yale psychiatrist named Dan Oren, who studies light therapy on a physiological, molecular level, and the effect of light on well-being and on the brain. And he was among the first to credit Cook with being a pioneer of this. He studied Cook's example as well, and he came to almost confirm some of Cook's crazier notions, like the way the light trapping parts of hemoglobin, of blood, are almost molecularly identical to the light trapping parts of plants. It's the same structure. One is built around iron, and one is built around magnesium.
Mm-hmm.
But so his intuition might have been wild. He was probably wrong half the time, but it led him to some great breakthroughs.
Yeah. You really came to love this guy. I feel like he definitely could have bilked you out of like $50,000.
I'm sure he could have, and I'm sure he would have. He would have believed himself that he wasn't trying to bilk me. I think he had a good heart. When he was thrown in jail, he claimed not that he was selling worthless shares, but that he was just guilty of optimism. He thought that the oil in the land that he was selling shares for, or that the oil wells would eventually strike a gusher. He was sure of it. And anecdotally, many of them later did after he'd served his sentence.
Yeah, you your portrait of him in the book is a really powerful example of like what you describe in the book as a very American sort of paradox, and that there's this extremely fine line between optimism and fraud. And
yeah,
he's just sort of the perfect
delusion.
example of that,
Yeah.
or delusion. Yeah. And I want to talk about quarantine because you mentioned that earlier. It's impossible to read this book in 2021 without reading it as at least partly a kind of quarantine parable. And Dr. Cook is one of the few characters who does really well, for the most part, in this impossible winter. And part of it, I think, is because of that sometimes delusional optimism. So I was going to ask you a couple of questions about this, which is, one, having written this book, researched this book, I wonder if you experienced quarantine differently, if it helped you in some way. And number two, if it did help you, if you were able to draw examples, what were those? What tips can you give the rest of us?
In a way, it did, because the book kept me busy during quarantine, and one of the reasons that Cook was able to fare so well is that he was preternaturally curious. His mind, it didn't matter where he was, if he was stuck in the ice or if he was in New York City or if he was in an igloo with he was, his mind was uncontainable, and the reason also that he fared the best is he had the most to do. He was the doctor on board, and so as everybody around him was suffering, he was necessary. He had a mission, he had a purpose, and one of the reasons that the men around him were suffering, one of many reasons, was that they felt a crippling sense of monotony and of despair and of uselessness. And so for me, the pandemic happened. I was finishing the last draft. I'd written most of the book, but it certainly kept me busy, and to the point where I hadn't even drawn. It took me a while to even draw the parallel, because we all thought it was going to be temporary, in the way that the men probably thought that their imprisonment in the ice would be temporary. And it's only after a while that it dawned on me that no, this is pretty serious, and it's having a profound effect psychologically on everybody I know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess we've heard this a lot through quarantine, and this is what Dr. Cook discovered was, he would almost set an arbitrary schedule for the men during these days where that were not defined by light in any way. You'd be like, well, you're up at 8 a.m. and you're working until 5 p.m. And we take a break for coffee at this time, and you do your light therapy, and you go for the what was the name of the walk on the ship?
The Madhouse Promenade.
The Madhouse Promenade, where the men would sort of stagger around.
They walk in circles and circles around the ship over and over and over again, mostly to keep their blood circulating and to keep them from their muscles from atrophying. But yeah, that was that should tell you how present the idea of madness and how it was in their day to day. And some men actually tipped all the way over into insanity and never recovered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about penguins, because penguins to me were like, there's so many things in this book. I remember the first penguin pops up and I was like, oh, that's cute. And then another penguin, and then the penguins just like take over the book in certain ways. They're sort of like a Greek chorus to all of this tragedy, with they're just sort of like waddling around and staring blankly. There's this incredible scene where the ship gets trapped early on, and there's in almost like an ice bowl, and you describe it as there's penguins and some other birds, auks or something, sitting up on the rim like in a stadium watching the men. And the penguins are sort of always there, and then they become like almost the hero of the book in certain ways.
Well, it's their environment, and so they bear witness to this. They and not only did they prove crucial to the survival of the men, but I think the men got quite attached to them. It did cause a lot of suffering for the men. They felt terrible about the need to kill these. They saw them as these little almost anthropomorphic creatures, and you read their diaries. They're quite fond of them. Even the scientist who had to take specimens home to Belgium. They took some on board as pets even, and then but it seemed like there was the ship must have been cursed, because on board several animals also seem to have fallen prey to a mysterious disease and to depression and just dropped dead, no matter how well they're being fed. But they had there's gruesome descriptions of how penguins were killed or even lured to their death. One of the crew members would play very poorly a cornet from the bow of the ship, and penguins would flock to him. It's as if he was the Pied Piper, and they would just be bludgeoned on the head with a ski or stabbed with an ice pick or something. It's really gruesome, but I'm glad that the penguins had an effect on you, because they really did on me as well. And one of the highlights of my research was going to the Royal Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels, which is where all of the biological and botanical, zoological and botanical specimens were sent, and where all the archives of the expedition were kept. And I was guided through the sort of corridors behind in the bowels of the museum by a scientist who it felt like a magic realist menagerie. It's just these old 1930s hallways, labyrinthine hallways, populated with taxidermy from all sorts of expeditions, and with no rhyme or reason. And so he finally is looking through. He finds this. It's like he goes to the warehouse at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he pulls out this big wooden crate. He's got a lab coat on, and he opens it up, and he pulls out a giant emperor penguin from 1898, and that was found on the pack ice. And for me, it was just an electrifying moment. It was like the closest I would come to meeting one of the characters that I was writing about.
What other, you describe in the essay at the end of the book, some touching another sort of artifact.
Cook's
one
sledge.
of the sledge. What other kind of key moments did you have with like pieces of this ship, or you read the captain's log as well?
That was it. That was the other one. It was the penguin. I did that same scientist got me to taste a bit of the alcohol or ethanol that some abyssal fish was kept. It was just looked like a nightmarish fish that was kept in a jar.
Pulled out of an ice hole?
No, I think it was before. It was when they were before the ice set in, when they were just sort of navigating along the peninsula. And then he told me, so do you want to taste it? So really? And people do that? And he goes, oh yeah, people do it all the time. And I think it might have been just, he reminds me of the scientist on the Belgica who had a sick sense of humor. And so, I dipped my finger in it and I tasted it. And he goes, what does it taste like? I said, disgusting. So, yeah, that's camphor. They put that in there so that people don't guzzle the alcohol that we keep back there. So I have even tasted an element of the story. But no, you're right about the logbook. That was the other highlight. I was very fortunate to have been given access to de Gerlache's log. I met with his great grandson, as well as his grandsons. And in their beautiful estate outside of Ghent, they pulled out this old 2-volume log. It looks like these, giant, almost Bible-like books. And we were flipping through page after page of their ancestors' descriptions, some of which were dry, but some of them were almost, tersely poetic and succinctly poetic. And it was like they were reading it for the first time too. They'd maybe seen a couple pages, but it was like we were reading an adventure novel together in the form of a log. And that's I think when the book came alive to me.
That's incredible. So you're turning pages and you're reading text that was written by hand in the place at the moments that you're reading about.
Yeah, and there's some haunting pages, not just for what they describe, but what they don't describe. For a lot, de Gerlache was among the sickest of the men. He was bedridden for a lot of the time. He couldn't bear to eat anything or speak to anybody, and his head was in searing pain. And he was also among the most gravely affected by scurvy. But the men thought that when the whole time he was in his cabin, they assumed that he was writing in his log. And at that time, when he was the sickest, page after page after page is empty, and all there is the coordinates that show the ship drifting aimlessly. And so it was almost like the Antarctic had gotten the better of him, and the pages were as barren as the landscape outside.
Wow, that's intense. Last thing I want to talk about is just this notion of, I mean, going into this book, I've never particularly cared about polar exploration. It's just not one of those things that gets me going. Yeah. But I think it's a perfect subject just in terms of, it's such a kind of pure way to think about obsession, any kind of obsession. I mean, we're all obsessed with something, whether it's K-pop or like TikTok or NBA basketball or whatever.
Yeah.
I got obsessed with Oklahoma City and wrote a whole book about that. Yeah. And
fantastic book.
Thank you. And the exploration of the poles, it just seems to me is like, it's, as you were saying, there's that kind of mystery and blankness to it. So it's almost the purest form of obsession one could have, especially back then. I guess, are you now obsessed with polar exploration? And
no, I'm not. I'm not obsessed with that. In fact, there's a lot of great stories that I ran into. A lot of them have been told, but a lot of them haven't. Like this one, is one of the great stories that had not adequately been told. But I don't think I want to revisit it because I love the fact that I had to learn all about it means that I was able to sort of translate my new obsession onto the page. That I was able to, everything that I didn't understand, I had to get to understand. And I think that freshness is something that I tried to bring to the page. But you're absolutely right about this idea of purity and of it being almost as much of a place as it is a metaphor. And I think before anybody even really explored it, it was it had become a literary theme. Coleridge, right after Captain James Cook in the 18th century spotted icebergs for the first time, that inspired the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and this almost mythical white land at the bottom of the earth became this a symbol of that which lies beyond human comprehension. And that was picked up by it became a literary theme on both poles. Or Frankenstein begins and ends with the deep Arctic. Edgar Allan Poe writes about in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. It ends with this mystical image of some kind of immense cataract at the South Pole, and that is a symbol for something. We have no idea what, but the end of the earth, Christ. Right. But it drew people in as if by magnetism, this idea.
Right.
And and you're right about the purity in that sense, that is just a straight shot for the unknown. But there's also a purity in the other sense of a moral purity. For exploration, for explorers, almost every other place you could explore was morally fraught. Especially for a Belgian, probably one of the most horrendous colonial experiments in human history, the Congo. I'm sure it had an effect on de Gerlache's thinking. He had been offered by the king to participate in this, and he had no appetite for it. However, in the Antarctic, where there were no inhabitants, it could legitimately be expressed as a desire for pure scientific observation and pure almost just a pursuit of a goal that had nothing to do with oppression or conquest. So in that sense, there was some purity too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it. We should wrap up. We're going to take some audience questions. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. The book, again, there's a link on your screen, Madhouse at the End of the Earth. is incredible. I can't recommend it highly enough. I mean, we didn't even talk about how beautifully you write about ice, because what they discover is they get to this pure white world and discover it's not a pure white world. The ice is full of colors. The ice is almost alive. It's making noises. It's breathing. It's shifting. It's really beautiful. But buy the book and you can read about that and admire that. And you can read the book before the movie comes out, so you can have moral superiority over your friends. Okay, let's see if I can manage audience questions by clicking my screen. Okay, here's a good one right off the top. If you, Julian, could travel with one of the officers from the Belgica, who would it be and why?
It would have to be Cook. It depends where I'm traveling. If I'm traveling to Mars, it's Cook, because I know that whatever problems we encounter, he would probably be, the best person to solve it. In fact, the physician, the anthropologist I spoke to, who has worked for NASA, who's been helping them design far-flung space missions, has said that when he's designing the physician role, he's thinking of Frederick Cook, a man who not only was ingenious and a jack of all trades and could solve practically any problem that was thrown in front of him, but he was also incredibly empathetic and made sure to keep everybody's spirits high. And I think if I'm traveling to someplace as remote as Antarctica or Mars, or as forbidding as those environments are, I think I would want somebody like Cook at my side. But in general, if I'm traveling to Paris or just anywhere where my life isn't threatened, I would probably take the somebody we didn't mention, the Romanian zoologist Emil Rakovița, who was the funniest guy. Even his writing, even today, is just even his serious scientific writing. You have this sense of whimsy and just an absurdist, Eastern European sense of humor, like a Ionesco or something. He was also the cartoonist on board. Every night he would bring this new drawing that would involve all of the caricatures of all the people on the ship, and it became a kind of comic opera on ice. It was just this vulgar, hilarious, over the top, series of cartoons. And I think that's, as somebody who has done cartoons in the past, I think I would really get along with them.
Cool. Okay, I had a question here from Brianna. She says, I think this book would make an incredible mini-series, and I'm curious who you would cast as Dr. Cook and Roald Amundsen.
I don't want to do the job of casting directors for them, but I will say that when I opened when I saw a photo of Frederick Cook, let me see if I can find one here. I think he's a dead ringer for Jake Gyllenhaal.
Yeah.
Right. He could be with behind a beard. You can, but he's got a I think, and also Jake Gyllenhaal is probably in his mid 40s, and every man on board was under 35. But people then looked older, especially after a long winter's night. Yeah,
the weathering these guys underwent and the aging, it's pretty intense.
Yeah, that's like another Poe story, Descent into the Maelstrom. They go down to this maelstrom and come out, and they've aged 10 years. That's funnily enough, that's exactly how the men of the Belgica described themselves after looking themselves in the mirror. That they looked 10 years older.
David asks, you have reported from every continent. How was Antarctica different in terms of isolation and the notion of being, quote, at the end of the earth?
Yeah.
How did that thought impact the writing of the book?
I feel pretty guilty about this, because when the only way I could find to get to Antarctica was via cruise ship. And so I wasn't really suffering the way the men were. In fact, I was enjoying martinis almost every night, as well as onboard entertainment. And I traveled with a Chilean operator called Antarctica 21. And the benefit to that was that I could fly over the Drake Passage and meet the boat at the South Shetland Islands, and that spared me about two days worth of one of the most notoriously nauseating crossings on the planet. So I didn't really suffer much, and that was one element of the guilt, with that I was enjoying myself in the same sublime terrifying waters where previously only the boldest adventurers dared to go. The other element is that, you know, when you're traveling there, it's always on your mind that the emissions that you are responsible for from the plane and from the ship are contributing to the desecration of this incredible land. But at the same time, it's opening up a lot of people's minds to, or it's showing the magnitude of what's at stake. And for a lot of people, they need to see what's at stake in order to feel the need to preserve it.
I'm curious, as a writer and reporter who's always trying to justify the most far-flung trips, to see things in person rather than just reading about them. What things did you see in person down there that informed your writing in the book? Like I was wondering about like the textures of the ice and the, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think, you know, you mentioned the polychromatic quality of the ice, and that's something that if I had only been relying on the photos that Cook, who was a magnificent photographer, by the way, but if I'd only been relying on the photos that he'd taken, I would have described an environment in black and white. And here I was able to see the enchanting spectrum of blues, all the way from the sort of deep royal blue of the caverns that the sea can carve into icebergs, to the turquoise of ice that's right beneath the water, to then there's the coating of yellow and green on the on sea ice, which is just phytoplankton in bloom, or the warm colors of lichen. So that's one area that I couldn't have relied on the diaries or the photos to describe. And then also the sounds of all these of all the sea life and all the barking of the seals, the braying of the penguins and the skuas. But I think the one detail that stuck with me that I came back to over and over again in the book is the smell. I was expecting a kind of a pure crystalline Antarctic air, and in fact, you know, a lot of the time, the smell that overpowered me was the rotten seafood reek of penguin rookeries, which is just, you know, it's like a dumpster behind a seafood restaurant on a hot summer day, and it was, I think, and then, you know, having smelled that, I encountered descriptions of it from the men that I would have otherwise missed, and I was like, oh, I know exactly what they were smelling there. So that, I think, you know, a friend, it's funny you should mention, because a friend asked me, well, why don't you just rely on the diaries? You know, you're not going to let yourself get caught in the ice. You know, you're not going to, you know, put your life in danger the way they did. So why do it at all? And I think I just, you know, to get the kind of detail that I was trying to write a nonfiction novel. So to get the kind of detail that I thought would fill out that environment, I had to go there myself.
I just scrolled down, by the way. Carol also asked that same question that I just asked. So good question, Carol. Seth asks, what was the writing process like? Did you write any chapters while still researching? What were some technological hurdles you had to overcome?
I researched for about a year, and then just sort of separated that from the writing process. I'd done the bulk, probably 90% of it beforehand. So there was the research, a few research gathering trips, one to Belgium, where I went to the family of the de Gerlaches and the Institute of Natural Sciences, and to Antwerp and Oslo, because of the Norwegian contingent in the presence of Roald Amundsen, the great Norwegian explorer who was the first mate on this ship and would end up being a legend of polar exploration. And then the main archives were held at the Cook's main archives were held at the Library of Congress, and I was able to get those through interlibrary loan to the New York Public Library and do them at the at the end of my workday. And I guess I wrote the book mostly on the train, commuting back and forth to New York. I've got about an hour and 20 commute, which, you know, adds up.
Whoa. Okay. Someone asks, do you see yourself writing another book about a different expedition? Someone else asked, would you go back to Antarctica? So I guess those are kind of related.
I'm desperate to go back to Antarctica and find a way to get my family to go with me. I would write a book about another expedition, but not another polar one. I think there was I don't know how I would make it new again, new to me or new to the reader. I would feel like something that I would consider already done or not worth mentioning. Another reader might, a reader who's new to this would find interest in that. And I don't think that I would think of those details if I've already written about one. But yeah, definitely, expeditions are great stories to write about. They have beginnings, middles, and ends, and they put people in really tough situations, and they typically come into conflict with nature, and it just makes for a great story.
This is my question. Do you have like a South Pole obsession, an equivalent of the South Pole in your life, whether it's something you want to write about or not? Is there like some subject that just looms in your mind and always had since you were younger?
Yeah. It's a family subject, and I don't know that it would be of any interest to other people. And for one, it's the story of my grandfather, who was he grew up in France, and he left as soon as the Nazis had taken Paris. He crossed the English Channel in a fishing boat and joined de Gaulle's forces, and then fought with the Free French forces throughout the war, and then met my grandmother during the liberation of Paris. And their first kiss was on top of his tank, or so I'm told. I have no idea. It's such a great story, but I don't know if it's too good to be true, and there's no way to back it up. They weren't people who kept a lot of records or letters. And so I'm always, it's just such a tantalizing story, and I don't know that I can ever tell it.
That sounds good. All right, a couple more quick ones that just came in. Max asks about the impact on the expedition of Roald Amundsen. That's a hard question to answer. What was his impact? Because he was absolutely crucial.
He was, but at the same, it became obvious to everybody there that he was the most suited to this kind of travel. He was the strongest, the most determined, the most fearless, and indeed all those qualities would pan out when he just broke record after record and claimed the holy grail of polar exploration with the South Pole, and actually claimed 3 holy grails. The South Pole, he blazed the Northwest Passage, and then ended up very likely being the first man to see the North Pole. But aboard the expedition, he was, he literally put out fires. I mean, there was at one point just the ship started bursting into flame, and he pulls out a panel and just runs outside and buries it in the snow. And when everybody else was panicking, he was able to compose himself. But I think in terms of his influence, his effect on the expedition, he was an apprentice. He was an apprentice to Cook, and would later credit Cook with saving his life and saving everybody's life on board, and would call him, when everybody else had abandoned Cook and considered him a punchline, Amundsen never did, and called him the greatest traveler I ever saw. The man was a genius, and he was the only person to visit him in Leavenworth, which I think was pretty telling.
When Amundsen went back to the South Pole, you tell this story late in the book. He wrote one of the most cold-blooded, kind of badass notes I've ever encountered. He was kind of racing this other explorer who was ahead of him, and beat him there, and left a little something for him at the pole for this other explorer. Can you tell that story quickly?
Yeah. So the Amundsen was in a race to the South Pole with a British explorer named Robert Falcon Scott, and he had beat him by almost a month. And when Scott gets there, Amundsen made this look easy. He had used sled dogs. He had made regular progress every day. He was going fast. He was healthy, and it was as if he didn't suffer at all. Meanwhile, Scott was broken down. He was pulling sledges he and his men were pulling sledges on their own. They were just absolutely, they were riddled with scurvy. And here they are, shells of their former selves, and they see in the distance the Norwegian flag flying. I could just imagine just how crestfallen they must have been. And they see a tent, which, by the way, had been built by Frederick Cook. And in the tent, they look at, and then Amundsen had written a note, said, "Dear Captain Scott, here's some food for you and your men. And should you get back home, please tell King Haakon that that we got here on this day." So he
brutal.
Brutal. He had given him provisions, which I guess was a gallant thing to do, but it feels almost more just like rubbing it in his face. That was the point of it. I do see
the other party all starved on the way back.
Yeah, and then of course, yeah. And footnote to that is they all died. All the British party died. I see a question in the side bar here from a certain Catfish. Was there a wild card discovery in your research that changed the direction of the story in ways you didn't see coming or never expected? And if so, what was it? I don't know that it really changed the story, but it was a wild card discovery. It might be a hunch, but I read that Cook, who was the photographer, as I mentioned, was developing photos on the ship in a dark room that was right off of the cabin of de Gerlache. And he was using, he had run out of fixer, which you need to set photos. And he had read somewhere that hydrocyanic acid, which is hydrogen cyanide, I believe, it could be used as a fixer. Now, this is an incredibly toxic gas. It is the main ingredient of Zyklon B, which was used in gas chambers. And they had it on board to euthanize animals. One drop on the tongue, and the animal was killed. So Cook, when he was developing photos, was obviously trying not to breathe, and he would run in and out. But the fumes would inevitably there was no window on the ship, I realized, and the fumes would have escaped and into de Gerlache's cabins. And I looked at the symptoms of chronic cyanide poisoning, and they were remarkably similar to what de Gerlache was experiencing: the sense of confusion, disorientation, lancing headaches, and other symptoms. So it's very possible that Cook might have accidentally poisoned his captain.
Wow. All right, let's wrap there, I think. There's the book again. Click your link, buy the book. Really fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samson. Thanks to everybody here. I'm really happy to talk about this book.
Thank you guys so much. Definitely a fascinating subject matter. And again, if you guys want to make a purchase, just click the link down below. And with that note, have a good night, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
All right, thanks.
And thanks, everyone.
Bye.